There's a fire starting in my heart.
Well, in Mexico, the drug war was launched in December of 2006 and really started in 2007. And it didn't take very long until we noticed that this supposed security strategy was resulting in an explosion of violence across the country. And when we look at the statistics now, what we see is there's a kind of an average of about 2,000 drug-related deaths a year before the drug war started by President Felipe Calderon, and afterward it goes up to like 15,000 a year. And they're of course concentrated in certain areas. It's not the same to live where I am in Mexico City, for example, as to live in Ciudad Juarez. But there are reasons for that too, and it has to do directly with the strategy itself. Because when you take out a drug lord in a certain area, it causes a turf battle between the cartels. So this whole strategy turned out to be completely destabilizing and really put the population at far greater risk. Then the next thing that we started to look at, because we work with organizations that have a gender perspective and we're looking at particular impacts on women, is that there's this incredible rise in violence against women. At first people go, well, come on, look at the statistics. Women are really a small percentage of the drug-related deaths, and that's true. They remain a fairly small percentage of those deaths because, as in any war, it's primarily between men. But within that, what we were seeing is that those deaths had particular messages involved with them. They had characteristics, almost all of them, of sexual violence. And also that women were involved in another way, which is that with the thousands of assassinations and the thousands of disappearances in the context of the drug war, it was women who were seeking justice and knocking on government doors and becoming human rights defenders because of simply demanding justice for their loved ones. And then, in a cycle, as they became human rights defenders, as they sought justice, as they received anywhere from indifference to hostility from the authorities and the government officials, they themselves became targets, either because the government officials were in cahoots with organized crime and they didn't want anybody investigating that, or because they came to be seen as a nuisance, or for a number of reasons, and they themselves became targets. And now we're seeing an increase in the murder of women human rights defenders. Enrique Peña Nieto has been very clear. In fact, the day after the election, one of the first messages he sent out was directly to the government of the United States saying, don't worry, we're going to keep the drug war. Because the government of the United States was worried. You know, this drug war that's happening in Mexico didn't come out of the blue, and it wasn't just some idea that popped into the head of Felipe Calderon. This has been in the works for a long time, and it's actually part of NAFTA, surprisingly enough. You have a trade and security agreement, a trade and investment agreement, rather, and then in 2005 they extended it into a security agreement between the presidents. It never went through Congress, and it was called the Security and Prosperity Partnership. And as a State Department official said, the idea was to arm NAFTA. Essentially, we're going to have Mexico protect U.S. investment in Mexico, because there was so much more with NAFTA, and take on U.S. security priorities. And so Mexico began to get counterterrorism laws like the Patriot Act that curtailed civil liberties in a country that's never had a history of international terrorism at all. And it began to see a much higher level of U.S. intervention. And the drug war was part of that. What the drug war has done is it's enabled the United States, not the Army, because there's still a real taboo against that, and there's constitutional prohibition against having foreign armies in Mexico, but you have DEA, you have ATF, you have the whole alphabet soup of FBI, CIA, of U.S. agencies operating on Mexican territory in a way that they never have before since the revolution. So this had been a long time goal of the Pentagon, to have that kind of access, and with the drug war they came in. And that's been one of the real reasons that it keeps going despite these disastrous results. Yeah, if you look at general opinion, it's pretty divided, and there's been some trending lately. But essentially, about half the population thinks that the model is failing. Almost everyone thinks that the model is failing. Some people believe that if it continues to go on, and if it's even intensified, having the army in the street and a real hardline crackdown, that there could succeed against the drug cartels. But a growing number of people are saying, no, this is not just failing, it's the wrong model and it's producing negative results. And that's growing because as time goes on, it's obvious. And also it's growing because of the movement that sprang up with Javier Cecilia, and even before that, the No More Bloodshed movement, where people started saying, you know, there's violence in Mexico, and it's not just because of organized crime, it's actually because of the government response to organized crime, that the militarization itself is causing violence. In Ciudad Juarez, places that were militarized earlier, they came to that conclusion earlier. But for much of the rest of the country, it took kind of a catalyst of this poet standing up and saying, I lost my son, and I blame not only organized crime, who were pretty clearly the culprits, you know, I mean the ones who actually committed the crime, but I also blame the government, because if it weren't for this strategy, we wouldn't have this chaos and warring between groups of organized crime that is catching so many innocent civilians and others in this web of violence throughout the country. Well, first of all, as we began to look at solutions, I mean, one of the big ones was to stop doing what we're doing now. Get the military out of the streets. It might not happen overnight because that could be too drastic of a change in some areas. But the general idea is to get the military out of the streets because they're not trained to do policing work. They are trained to annihilate an enemy. And when you're talking about an enemy that is part of your own population, the human rights situation, for example, is a nightmare. Human rights violations committed by the military, which most of them haven't even been investigated and proved, but the number of grievances that have been filed has increased about tenfold since they started doing this drug war work. And the other is to begin to look at the problem again as a health problem, not just in Mexico, because in Mexico there's a consumption problem. It has been growing, but it's nothing. It's not what generates this like $38 billion a year market that the drug cartels are fighting over. And so it's really, the drug policy problem is more here in the United States than it is in Mexico. If there was a policy to regulate instead of prohibit drugs, and probably starting with marijuana because it's the least problematic in terms of the health problems of the drug itself, then you would almost overnight take this huge chunk of income generating activity out of the hands of organized crime. You'd have legal sourcing, you would have regulation. They would not be able to have the market only to themselves with the situation now, because they've never been able to reduce the market. It's completely not viable. They know that already. So somebody is actually defending the fact that there's this gigantic black market, you know, and it's time to end that. It's time to say, no, we can't complain about drug cartels and their power and their wealth on the one hand, and on the other hand maintain a monopoly market for those same drug cartels. It's always hard to say because it's a clandestine activity. When the legalization measure came up in California, there were some estimates that came out from organizations that have a good basis, at least for estimating. And the most common one said that 60% of their income comes from marijuana. So again, we don't know if that's exactly right or in the but it's no doubt in the ballpark. And in addition, they talk about marijuana being the most liquid form of revenue. It's kind of the easiest in a lot of ways. And so it's really, really important to them to have that marijuana income. I mean, if you took that market out of their hands, it would be a tremendous blow. Well, we're not that far. I think we're probably not as far as some people might imagine, because when it went down in California, it wasn't a huge margin, and now we've got a referendum up in Colorado and in Washington State. There's one in Oregon too that has less chances. In 3 states are coming up. There's, I think, like 16, 17 states that already have medical marijuana. It looks like there's possibilities in some of these states that are coming up. So what's happening, there seems to be, and now when you poll, the polling shows that a good half the population is in favor of legalization. And in some states, of course, much farther, because there's differences because of the political cultures of the different states. So there's a trending toward favoring legalization because of the cost of the drug war, and because it's like, what is the point of having something that you know you're never going to beat, and that's so common, and that in addition, does less damage than alcohol, being prohibited? And people are beginning to hear this argument of like, look at prohibition, didn't work, caused the rise of gangsters, they got rid of it, goodbye problem of gangsters, and people are going, oh yeah. Yeah, I think it's one of the most important things that we can do. I definitely do. And it also makes it possible for a lot of other just drug-oriented programs to be handled in a much more common sense way, where you no longer have this demonization of drugs as some kind of outside evil force, but you say, okay, here's the health problems. You can talk to kids and say, instead of just saying no to everything because your soul will go to hell if you don't, say, look, these are the different drugs, these are the different risks, this is really serious, this is maybe not so serious, but be careful of, whatever other kinds of things. And plus they also know that in a lot of cases, one of the things that's really dangerous for kids is that they have to be in contact with criminals in order to procure drugs that are part of their everyday social life in a lot of ways. So you've got this very perverse situation going on. And I think there really is a possibility of change, and that we're already seeing it even in places where there isn't legalization or there's lowest enforcement priority. But now what's been really kind of disappointing about it is that we expected the Obama government to be more responsive and more open to at least debating this issue, and that hasn't been the case. They've cracked down on states' rights to medical marijuana laws. They've said that they're going to keep going after this. There's been mixed messages sometimes, but in actions it's been a very hard line. So,
why do you think that is?
I don't know exactly why that is, because like I say, it was kind of a surprise. Gil Kirilkowski, the drug czar, came from Seattle, where there is a lowest enforcement priority on marijuana. There was every reason to believe that they were going to take a different attitude on it. A lot of people in Washington, I gather, are optimistic, or maybe that a second presidency, when the political issues don't come in as much, there could be some kind of a change. But up to now, what we've seen has not been positive, and if it comes down to it, we could be seeing a state against federal government battle on these issues, especially if like Colorado and or Washington pass these, and it's going to go into a legal terrain that's not at all clear. But at least the important thing is to be on the record that the U.S. population is saying we want a different way of dealing with this. Well, in Mexico, there's no question but that organized crime is a problem. Nobody's arguing that it's not, and that it doesn't have to be combated in some way, shape, or form. So the question then, of course, is what do you do? And if you withdraw the police and you eliminate this strictly interdiction and arrest and, in most cases, killing drug lords, which is the current model that we have, then again you can turn to a more health-oriented model, and you can begin to. It wouldn't be in any way like tolerating the existence of drug cartels, but if you reduce the direct confrontation, you can begin to attack them in other spheres. And I think one of the most important spheres, in addition to cutting off their market, which would be the drug policy reform in the United States, is money laundering. When you compare what they're spending on the military equipment to what they're really actually doing in the field of money laundering, it's minimal so far. There was a huge case with HSBC, and they got like a $23 million fine in Mexico. They're looking to possibly get a much stiffer fine here in the United States, but still, compared to the universe of illicit money that's feeding the financial systems, it's a nonviolent way of attacking them, and has the potential to be far more effective. I think one of the big reasons that we're not seeing it now is because it's an important source of money to the legitimate financial system. Yeah, we have some precedents. In Portugal, they've had a decriminalization policy in effect for quite a while. And what they found is that there, in the medium to long term, there isn't an increase in consumption, and that they've had a decrease in crime and a decrease in the related health effects of drug use. So the results have been really quite positive. We don't have as many precedents in legal sourcing, which is what's of concern to us in Mexico, because, like we said, that's where you take the market away from. There's more kind of decriminalization programs, and there's some legal sourcing in California, but the experience has been too short to have a real clear idea of it, and it's been under constant attack from the federal government as well. So right now, for example, there's a law that's being proposed in Uruguay that looks like it has a lot of possibilities of passing, where they're saying, we reject the drug war model, and they are going to have to enter in completely to figuring out how do you regulate it. If you say, okay, we're going to regulate drugs instead of making them illegal, instead of prohibiting them, they're going to have to deal with those questions, and it's going to be a fascinating experience, because they're putting forth that they're going to have state control over the sale of marijuana, that it's then going to pass to a private entity, but under state control. And they've got their plans out, but they've got a lot of fine details to work through. That'll be a real precedent for for other people. So the proposal to regulate instead of prohibit these drugs is new, and especially the part of it that refers to legal sourcing, which is the part of it that's really important for Mexico and places where the supply side drug war has been imposed. And one of the countries, the only one that has a really more comprehensive framework set forth now for legal sourcing and legalization, is Uruguay. And it's still before the Congress, and even after it passes Congress, which actually has a lot of possibilities of happening, they have to figure out the fine points of how do you regulate this. And a lot of other countries are going to be watching, because of course in Latin America, Guatemala and Colombia have started to demand that there be a more open debate on legalization as well. And we have the Global Commission on Drugs and Democracy with the former presidents, Cedillo of Mexico, of Brazil, of Colombia. I mean, there's a kind of a groundswell toward legalization in Latin America. So Uruguay, for example, is saying it's going to be state-controlled marijuana sales and consumption. We're going to set out 150 hectares for production of marijuana, And the state's going to have the supervision and the regulatory role, and then it'll pass to a private entity that will handle the marketing. You know, they're beginning to really work out the fine details, so it'll be a very, very interesting experience for all countries that are watching to see how they figure this out and if it works out. Well, we've been talking here in Houston with organizations, and of course in the caravan it was an opportunity to kind of compare experiences of the drug war model in Mexico and in the United States. And sometimes we think of it as separate because they're different phenomena that are happening. We don't see the outright violence here. But what we found is that it's not that separate. That there is this motivation behind the drug war and the military and the prison model of it that is really oriented towards social control of certain populations. In Mexico, it's indigenous people, it's people who are in areas where there's resources that are of interest to developers. It's youth in general that are being suspect and considered criminals. And that's also true in the United States, especially youth of color. When you look at the statistics of who's behind bars, you know there's an equal user rate between whites and African Americans and Latinos, and yet the people who are behind bars are the youth of color. So it was a fascinating experience both for them to compare their pain, because for a mother in the United States to have her child in prison for years and years or up to life for possession or dealing or drug-related crimes, and is really, it's almost the same as the mothers from Mexico who have had their children assassinated or disappeared. I mean, the families are broken, the pain is profound, and those women no more looked at each other than they recognized that shared identity, and there were some very, very moving moments in that sense. And then again, on the political policy level, we realized the damage that this drug war does and how it is oriented toward social control of certain parts of the population, and that there was a real sense in which what was even being portrayed as a model for dealing with organized crime, that we would say the wrong model, goes much beyond that. It's not even just a model for dealing with organized crime, or it's so much a model for dealing with organized crime as this model that controls populations, that gives the upper hand to a military police state type of a government, and that also has economic interests behind it, including in the case of Mexico, these contracts through the Merida Initiative. They're going to private companies like Blackwater, DynCorp, Boeing, and Lockheed for the military equipment. They're actively lobbying to keep the drug war going because it's a war. It's a war industry, and they need a war. And there's also a lot of lobbying or a lot of pressure from the Pentagon for the reasons I described at the beginning, that they've attained so much more influence within Mexican territory for their own security, national security agenda. So when you change the framework of drugs as a social problem from a framework of, community security to a framework of national security, then you're no longer protecting people, you're protecting states and powerful interests. And when that happens, it's people that suffer. And that's what we're seeing on both sides.
Finally, I can see you crystal clear.